wherever you're wherever you're presenting resiliency, you may need to reframe it, you may need to retitle it, you may find people are sick of the word. So we're going to talk a little bit about reframing the information, other ways you can use it besides actually giving a training. And it just will anchor us in the basic concepts of how resiliency happens. And then we're going to look at a particular way to use resiliency that's really simple. And it's a tool that a lot of people have found if they just use this tool, it's amazingly transformative. And that's the resiliency chart. So we'll do that in depth. I'm going to talk a bit about the resiliency workbooks. And then we will spend time on resiliency and trauma-informed practices. And that's something that I have to say, Essex County, New York has really taken a lead in connecting and integrating those two concepts, which is really, really needed. So we'll spend time on that. I'm going to talk about resiliency in the workplace because you may find that's your entree, that what people really need, and especially as we get deeper into winter, is it's so funny because having trained lots of educators over the years, so many times the teachers will just say to me, forget the kids, I need this myself. I mean, that's like a direct quote. So we're going to talk about resiliency in the workplace and then some possible next steps. I want to also say before we do this next round of introduction, however you have used resiliency is a positive. So do not feel apologetic if you didn't go out and do some major training, because what I know is that resiliency is populating your conversations. So I want to do another round, and I would like everyone to share one way that you have used the resiliency information. Now, there's some of you here that have used it and used it and used it and used it. But there's others that may just have one or two anecdotes. And I'm going to use you as an example, Jessica. In a meeting a few months ago, Jessica shared that she was in a conversation with a mother where she was talking about the resiliency wheel, and this mother had never considered the concept of boundaries. And boundaries is one of the 6 external protective factors that is really crucial in fostering resiliency. And to think that a mother had never thought about boundaries until she had this conversation with Jessica was really kind of amazing to me, because if there's any person that needs to know about boundaries, it certainly is a parent. So that's one example. Maybe clear on the other end is what Dana's doing with Harry in the jails, where really delving in and doing a lot of presenting using the resiliency workbook. But if you've only had a conversation, I know in Deborah's case, I was able to have a meeting with her and I think one of her supervisors or colleagues. And so just having that meeting through Deborah's liaison brought the concept of resiliency into Mountain Lake Services. So however you've used it, one quick example, and let's go around the circle again, and whoever would like to jump in and start, one quick example of how you've used it or what your interest is in it, because if it's Emma's first day, she maybe hasn't used it a lot. So how you've used it or what your interest is in it, just quickly as we go around again.
I'll start. Go ahead. Oh, sorry. No, I can. The resiliency. So my background's, I'm a chiropractor. And so a big part of my approach to care was getting strategies for patients to find better self-efficacy and more of their own health promotion and things they can do to control their pain so that they're not dwelling on it. So there was a lot of those principles reflected in this, which I thought was really interesting. So it's basically like same idea, different target, different lingo. So I thought that was really neat, actually.
Yeah, one of my best friends is a chiropractor, and she really encouraged me when I was writing the resiliency workbook. And we talked about that philosophy of chiropractic, where if given the right circumstances, the body can heal, right? That's a philosophy. And it's the same with resiliency, that there are resiliency building factors that help people to heal. And in the chiropractic case, it's more physical. In resiliency case, it's probably more in terms of life healing, emotional healing, psychological healing. But it is the same philosophy. So that's great, Emma. Who else? A way that you've used it. Now, some of you have probably a list of stories that could take another hour, but we'll just one example how you've used it.
I will go, Nan. I'm probably a bit of an overachiever with this, but I'll give one simple example because I think this story, and this was as early as yesterday during an event that we kind of discovered this, but we were talking about protective factors. So the protective factors within the resiliency wheel that Nan Henderson had identified. And we were talking about the story as a childhood and prepping. And she's like, I had no trauma. I had a really good upbringing, great parents. I did all the sports. I did everything, right? And then she got on to her story, and we're trying to connect protective factors. We're trying to do some resiliency mapping. And she went on to, she had an aunt that had substance abuse severe, and she thought it was the coolest aunt, whatever. And I was like, oh, okay. And, some other family members had substance abuse. I was like, so what stopped you? I was like, were you exposed to it? Were you exposed to this as a teen? You thought this person was cool? What stopped you? So we ended up, walking it backwards to her father was really setting those boundaries, and she was able to list it because of the resilient wheel and connect how she was already resilient, or what those resilient factors were as she was being raised, and was kind of like this light bulb going up. And this was a very, very educated woman. And it was connecting those dots of, oh, I'm already resilient. So, sometimes it's not always just trauma. It's those factors are in place on how we were born resilient, or we have resiliency, and just organizing those thoughts.
Sorry. I found this over and over again. People will come up and say, well, at the beginning of a presentation, I'm here for my work, but I'm really resilient. I didn't have any trauma. I didn't have any problems. I've done really well. And then as they hear the presentation, they will realize the reason they did well was because all of the factors that build resiliency are in place in their lives. And it's a huge aha. So I love that you're sharing a conversation, because that is one of the ways that resiliency spreads, is just through conversations. I know you've had a lot of them, Jessica. So Dana, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing with resiliency?
Yes, it's I'm not a person that is quick to think of examples on the spot.
Well, just describe what you're doing. Just describe what you're doing. You don't have to share an actual example, just the work you're doing.
All right. So as you mentioned, Harry Bassett from Mental Health Association and I are co-facilitating groups at the local jail. We last week just wrapped up the first group. We went through the whole workbook. And it's been a really great experience. And in December, we're going to open it up to the full population. We kind of did a little pilot with just one of the pods and some local people, because we have both local and federal incarcerated people in our jail. Yeah, so we'll be doing it with both women and men, and yeah, I'm pretty excited to continue doing it.
So how did the population receive it, Dana?
They received it really well, and I would say that it was they all took something a little bit different from it, and I think that really speaks to the material, because we all have our own types of resiliency and our own ways of life. So I think it was maybe a way to look at things that they hadn't before, because a lot of the programs that are in the jail are not as strength-based or person focused. They're really like prevention. They're beautiful groups and really effective, but this material is maybe a little bit more strengths-based.
One of the things Harry said in a meeting I was in that he attended is that somehow being able to tell one story with a resiliency lens allows folks to share a little more deeply. In a way, it feels like, or it seems like it gets past that shame barrier, and people can put that spin on it, and through that container share a lot more in depth about the trauma and the tragedy and the adversity in their lives. And that
there was one person that was able to reflect how a history of being involved in game-related activity created resilience within them.
Mm-hmm.
So
I've heard that before. Yeah. Okay, who else would share a way you've used the material? Like I said, even in a conversation. Rayanne, did I see your hand? Yeah.
Yes, so I've used it both in groups here on the child adolescent unit, as well as on the adult psychiatry unit. And then if you look at my bookshelf, I do have some of the books I had requested from Stephanie, because I have on an individual basis provided some books to older adolescents who took from that group and wanted to work through that workbook on their own in discharging from the hospital. So.
And what's the response been, Rayanne? Can you share a little bit of a response, either an individual story or in general?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges I've faced here on child and adolescent is that we have children from anywhere early, like 11, 12, to as old as 17, 18 still enrolled in high school. So the challenge for me has been delivering the information in a way that can be well received by the diverse age range that we may have in the milieu at any time. So on an individual basis, I've received a lot of positive feedback, and have really been able to identify a few adolescents over the last couple of years that really were in a place to do that work more independently, and motivated to do so. I think the resiliency wheel, and identifying the strengths that we all have, and the idea that something is always going well, especially in the population that we are working with here, builds motivation for change, and also provides greater insight as to their desire to live and move forward with their individual treatment and goals and progress in those. So that's where I've been able to kind of work it into some of the work that we do.
Do you find, Rayanne, that it's empowering for people?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because my experience is that so many folks that are in various agencies, various treatment facilities, jail, have so much negative input, so much labeling in their lives. So much of that environment has been all that's wrong with them. That when they start to identify with what's right with them, that it does become empowering for them to realize that there are positives and there are strengths, and it's kind of revs the engine. Has that been your experience?
Absolutely. And building off those strengths to identify goals for individual treatment has been especially empowering, and I think builds motivation versus, and I guess partnership with the children and adolescents in identifying what their goals may be and meeting them where they're at in their treatment. So identifying those protective factors, those resiliency factors have allowed us to be successful in doing that.
Great. Anybody else be willing to share a way you've used this in a conversation or in your work?
I'll go. We work, so at Head Start, we work with a population of individuals that the majority of them have a lot of stress and trauma in their lives. Poverty, how to feed your family, how to provide for medical care, oral care, keeping your car on the road, all kinds of things. There's a lot of barriers. A lot of times, many of the families come when I have conversations with them, they feel broken, they feel worthless, they feel like things are impossible. So, you know, listen and provide feedback in the way that there are organizations out there that can help you, and you take one step at a time. On so, you know, a lot of these families, and one example would be one parent, it was a 2-parent family household. We started going over the goals and strengths, and she said, I couldn't even begin to tell you what strengths we have, because I can't even see any. So I said, well, there's 2 of you together, and you have your children, and you are working hard. I said, every time I've come here to visit, the house smells of these wonderful aromas of cooking. I can tell you're an excellent cook, and you're providing that warm comfort to your family, you know. And so we carried on, and she just kind of looked at me sort of in awe, like, they, you know, you have this veil over your head, and it's so hard to see beyond that. And to count those. Some people call them blessings, whatever you want to call them. So, you know, unfortunately, I feel that a year with a family is not long enough, because it takes a lot for a family to let down their being overprotective of the status quo that they feel people are seeing them. And then on a personal level, I lost my son, 37 years old, July 9th, or 7th. And yeah, and it was I believe overdose. I think fentanyl was involved. I haven't received the toxicology report back, but it was terrible. So I may get a little weepy, but I tried very hard, and I kept this stuff with me. And I tried to use it as much as I could with him. But because he moved in with me, had a child and his girlfriend. And unfortunately, I think he was very deep into his problem, and it had been so many years. But he's at peace, and it happened. So one thing that I did hear was on YouTube, and it was a psychologist talking. And she said that we have to break the re-traumatizing of ourselves, because we keep going over and over in our head. And but anyway, the biggest resiliencies that I've been able to have is knowing that you aren't on this rock by yourself. Number one, I had other children. We were supportive. I have friends that were supportive, and I keep a close circle, small circle of friends. And I have coworkers that I would call friends, come right to your aid. And the people that I work for, very supportive. But anyway, so that thing that I heard from the psychologist was like, you know, stop the wheel from turning of just re-traumatizing yourself too. It's okay to say, all right, this is done, it's over, I'm a strong person, I'm moving ahead. And when I saw the doctor to refer myself to a counselor, just for what it can help, he asked me if I had any suicidal ideations or anything. I says, oh, hell no. You know, I'm fine. I'm not thinking that. I don't want to die. So, yeah, but having boundaries, and I place those boundaries in the household.
Yeah.
I communicated when I was feeling uncomfortable, because I thought things were going well and I was feeling good about that. I set and communicated high expectations. This will happen. This won't happen. There's not going to be yelling or shouting or problem. And you have a baby, and I will have to call CPS if I find that child is not able to be cared for. So, and he helped with that too, to some degree. And I provided not only caring and support for him and her and the baby, but I also did for myself.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing. Yeah.
Yes. So in all of that, that's a nutshell.
Well, what's so interesting, Roberta, is that so many people use this personally. You know, I've trained thousands and thousands of people, and I can't tell you the number of folks that came up and said, oh my gosh, this is what I needed. I needed this.
Absolutely.
I'm going through this tragedy. I need to reach out and get the caring and support. I need to have the life skill. You know, I'm really aware and supportive of the fact that you used your own life skills to say, okay, I'm going to go out and get the help I need. That takes the motivation. You saw the psychologist. She gave you a life skill of turning down that monkey mind. And so I hear that you've integrated it both in your life and just a terrible, as well as you mentioned how hard it is for families that we work with or people we work with that have gotten such negative feedback in their lives to let down that barrier. And my experience is when you come from a strength resiliency perspective, it's easier for people to let down. It doesn't mean they do it right away, but when you go into that house, I just love this image of you going into this house with these people that are so programmed about everything that's wrong with them, everything that's wrong with them. And you say, I feel the love here. I can tell you cook here. I feel the nurturing here. I see the two of you together here. This, and I'll use this as kind of a summary to move into the meat of our presentation this morning, the basic, it's morning here, afternoon there. You develop what I've called a resiliency perspective or resiliency eyes. You were able to go in, and people have said it's like going to the eye doctor and getting a whole different pair of glasses. You were able to go in there and see strengths that my guess is without this perspective and background, other people wouldn't see. They'd just go right into the problem, right into, again, making these folks feel diminished. And you were able to go in and see those strengths. Was it such a gift to anybody who's struggling, for them to know that there is something right, that they do have strengths and that they can build on those strengths. So kudos to you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Thanks.
As we go through the basic presentation, I want you all to think about questions that have come up or challenges that you've encountered. So a couple of folks have already mentioned challenges. How do you use this material clear down to age 11? And then Roberta's challenge of not feeling like she has enough time. Other challenges that you face as you use this material. And you might want to make a note when you think of who you are using this material with, who you're interacting with. If you can make a note of what are the challenges, what are the questions that have come up. And then as I go through this material, I want you to think about what you might hear that meets those challenges or questions. And we'll also come back to the questions that you have at the end of me doing the basic presentation. Now, I'm going to do this basic presentation pretty quickly, probably in about 40 or 45 minutes, and we will take at least a short break halfway through our 3 hours. And the reason I'm doing it fairly quickly is because sometimes, in fact, often you have only a short amount of time. So when Terry Morse asked me to do this for the Essex County Community Mental Health Services Board, she said, 30 minutes, Nan, you have 30 minutes, 30 minutes to basically tell us all about resiliency, but that's very typical. So you have the outline of the basic resiliency presentation from the training of trainers, and you can follow along if you want. You don't have to. You'll notice that there are places that I skip, because when you are presenting this information to any audience, you have a time constraint. You also have, what are the needs of that audience? So this was a community mental health board. So I knew I needed to stick in some stuff about connecting resiliency to mental health. And there is a very, very strong connection. So I made that change, and you'll see that in this presentation. You want to think first and foremost, what is the need of this audience? If it's a time issue, then you go through and decide what are the most important points. If they're focused on addictions, mental health, trauma-informed care, make sure that you have a piece in your conversation or in your presentation that connects to what their specific focus is. So the slides that I'm going to share are very similar to the ones that you all got who went to the resiliency training of trainers. And I have updated them a bit, and I'm going to have Stephanie send them out to you after we're done today. So let me just see if I can share my screen here. Okay. Now, here we go. All right. Can you all see that?
Yes, it looks great.
Yes.
Yes.
Everybody see it, yeah. So one of the things I've learned along the way, and I know you all have learned it as well, is that you have to take some kind of academic terms and put it in more common language. So the idea of building bounce back, kids, adults, families, and organizations, is something that people can easily relate to. How do you build bounce back? So often that will be in the title of my presentations: Fostering Resiliency, How to Build Bounce Back Kids, Families, Adults, Organizations. One of the things I like to emphasize about the resiliency material, it doesn't make any difference if you are working with 11-year-olds, or you are working with elders, or you are working with adult families. What's beautiful about this research is that the same factors come up over and over again as being resiliency building. The same factors depending on the age, the same factors depending on the adversity. These factors, and I at this point have reviewed hundreds of studies, every kind of adversity. Same factors come up over and over and over again. They come up cross-culturally. So it's not as if we have to find different resiliency factors for different ages, different groups, different cultures, or different adversity. What I'm sharing with you today transcends all of that, and it goes across all ages, all groups, all adversity. As I define resiliency, I always talk about unlocking the power of resiliency. Now, we heard already today in some of your sharing the power of resiliency, what it was like for this couple that Roberta met with, to hear about their strengths. The fact that Rayanne is finding it motivating, or Dana too, that people can share more deeply when they have a resiliency lens. unlocking the power of resiliency. Resiliency is powerful. And if we don't focus on it, we won't be able to unleash its power. So I talk about the need to focus on resiliency. The capacity, you can see here the definition, to spring back, rebound, successfully adapt in the face of adversity. Develop social or academic or work competence despite exposure to severe stress, or simply the stress of today's world. So another key point about resiliency, about the information I'm sharing, is that this is a stressful world. There isn't a person alive who cannot benefit from this information. Just as Jessica was sharing, this woman she was talking to had no idea what it was in her life that allowed her to do as well as she's done. It is universally applicable and useful. Again, that's been my experience over about 3 decades and tens of thousands of people that I've interacted with. There is within everyone, according to resiliency researchers, a self-writing and transcending ability, an innate self-writing and transcending ability. That is a revolutionary concept. All these years later, I look at that and think, how many practitioners, how many educators, how many agency folks do not walk into their work with the concept that every single person has within them an innate self-writing and transcending ability. But this does come from resiliency research. And resiliency research, I will add at this point, is a body of research studies from psychology, psychiatry, sociology, particularly those fields, many decades, many kinds of populations. And this is the conclusion. Given the right circumstances, the resiliency building environment that we're wanting to create, we then allow this innate self-writing and transcending ability to flourish. I keep coming back to the story that Roberta shared. I'm imagining how this couple felt after this worker, whatever Roberta's title is, came into their home and talked about the strengths. What that does is that touches that innate self-writing and transcending ability. One of the reasons that strength-based practice is the cornerstone of resiliency, and actually trauma-informed care as well, is that it touches and it helps that innate self-writing and transcending ability to flourish. So one of the things that I've written in some of my articles, and you can go to my website, those of you who haven't been there, there's a lot of things there that you can read and download at no cost. I wrote an article called Hardwired to Bounce Back. And I love that concept. We are hardwired to bounce back. And when people hear that, just hearing that research has validated this, again, helps to generate that resiliency capacity that everyone has within them. So I think that as you look at these concepts and definitions, I'm hoping you'll think about the populations that you're working with, how you can communicate in language that they'll understand. I love this hardwired to bounce back because most people can get that with the computer analogy here. And to think about how it is that you can communicate these key concepts, again, from a body of social science research. This isn't my bright idea. This isn't your bright idea. This is the conclusion of decades of social service, of social science research. So the question comes up, how does resiliency happen? How does resiliency happen? If someone were to say to you, okay, Jessica, how does resiliency happen? So often you'll hear us talk about resiliency building factors because people can relate to that, but the academic term is protective factors. And I know there's a little more information, a little more understanding coming out about what protective factors are. It's still not a really common term, but the actual academic term, how does resiliency happen? Resiliency happens because of protective factors. So this discussion of protective factors comes from one of the early resiliency researchers, Dr. Richard Jesser, a psychologist at the University of Colorado. Dr. Jesser studied adolescents. What we know now from decades of resiliency research is that this concept applies no matter what the age or the circumstances of the individual. But Dr. Jesser looked at adolescents. So what he basically concluded is that many kids who seem to be at high risk, again, the idea that they may have a lot of ACEs, they may have had a lot of adversity, they may have had terrible trauma in their lives, nevertheless do not succumb to risk behavior or get less involved in it than their peers or abandon it more rapidly than others do. An answer as to why this is true is that there was exposure to risk. Again, that's stress, adversity, ACEs. But here's the key concept. It was countered by exposure to an experience of protection. Protective factors moderate, buffer, insulate against, and thereby do mitigate the impact of risk on human development. Protective factors. So I just love Jessica's story because here's this woman she's talking with who thinks she's had, you know, a trauma-free life, and maybe she has, though I don't think any of us go through this life without some trauma. And just thought, you know, that's the way my life was. And then she starts to see this information about how it is people do well. I mean, that's another way to frame resiliency research, how it is people do well. And she realized, oh my gosh, I have this condition and this condition and this condition and this condition. And so one of the ways I find myself having to reframe resiliency is that people hear the term and they think it means, okay, you just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and you're resilient, but it does not mean that. That's kind of a myth about it. But in reality, there is all this information about how people are resilient, and they're resilient because of these factors in their lives. What has resiliency studied? I stick this in here, and this is from an academic article, but I just want to emphasize what I already talked about is that resiliency has studied pretty much everything you can think of in terms of adversity. So this comes from Dr. Ann Maston, Dr. Jay Barnes. Ann Maston is just an iconic resiliency researcher at the University of Minnesota. One of her papers is that resiliency has studied child neglect, abuse, separation, loss, family or neighborhood violence, terror or war, natural disasters, poverty, hospitalization, and many other kinds of adversity. I'm sure I'm not the only one today that is just heartsick about the images of war that now proliferate our television screens and all of our news feeds. And it's horrible. We wouldn't wish it on anyone. And yet, I hold within my own consciousness the fact it is possible for people to bounce back. And in my last newsletter, and if you haven't signed up, you should go to my website and sign up for my newsletter. I published information from Harvard, researchers who've looked at children of war, children from war. And it's so easy still for us to look at people going through horrible trauma and think, okay, that's it. Their life is done. Once this trauma is less, once it ends, they are scarred irretrievably, and that's it. And yes, they are scarred, and yes, they are resilient. It's that holding two things at the same time that seem opposite but are true. And resiliency research has looked at this, what we're looking at on our screens now, the terror of war, the violence. It's horrible. There are scars, there are wounds, they will last. But these people will also be resilient. When you think about it, human history is a history of resilience. It's not a history of freedom from violence, terror, war, adversity. In fact, it is a story of all of that, but it's also a history of resilience. So these researchers went on to write, some studies focused on one kind of traumatic experience, so rape or loss of a parent, while others assessed cumulative risk or multiple life events. However, and we see this now, single adversities are rare. It's rare for you to work with a couple, a group, a person, a child that's just had one bad thing happen. Because most adversity reflects chronic, repeated, combined exposures to traumatic events or hardships. As a result, many studies of resilience include indices of cumulative risk in some form. So again, I include this because this is not a Pollyanna approach to life. This is not toxic positivity. Resiliency research looks at the worst of what humans have to go through, and yet pulls out these factors that help people to bounce back. So I'm only going to describe this now, and then we're going to do this in depth after I finish the basic presentation and we take a break. But there is one tool that I would encourage you to think about using, and it's called the resiliency chart. And what I love about Roberta's story is she did this. She did this without even knowing she was doing it. So typically when we're called into a situation or we're working with a client or we're working with individuals, we fill out in our minds everything that's wrong. So I call that the left-hand side of the chart, everything that's wrong. And in Roberta's example, I mean, she didn't go into all the things that was wrong with this family, but I'm sure they're, dealing with, poverty and job loss and perhaps, their own self-esteem issues. And I mean, we could fill in the left-hand side of the page. But what is so powerful about the resiliency chart is the right-hand side of the page. The right-hand side of the page. How have you done as well as you've done? What are strengths? And Roberta also shared how she did this in her own life. She looked in the most horrible circumstance any of us can imagine, the loss of a child. She looked in her own life and she basically said, I have these strengths to get through this. I have my circle of friends. I have my family that's supportive. I have my coworkers that's supportive. I have my own personal ability and motivation to go out and get the help that I need. I can search and see skills that will be useful for me, and I can start to implement them. That's the right-hand side of the page. And in my opinion, we need to spend more time on the right-hand side of the page. I want each of you to think about the population that you work with the most. And here's the question. Do they need more information about what's wrong with them? Or do they need more information about what's right with them? And you can all answer that silently, and then we'll come back to have a discussion of this after I'm done. When I've worked with groups of high school and middle school kids, I ask them, as you go through your typical day, what percentage of messages do you get about what is wrong with you versus what is right with you? So I want you all who are listening to me, think about the populations that you're working with. What percentage of messages does that population get about what's wrong with them versus what's right with them? Here's what the kids tell me. 90 to 95% of the messages they get in a day are about what's wrong with them. 5 to 10% are about what's right with them. I can't emphasize this enough. When people bounce back, it's because what's right with them gets stronger. That's how they bounce back. That's why it's so important that Dana and Harry are leading those groups in jail, where all of those folks in jail have so many messages on the left-hand side of the page about what's wrong with them, and so few messages about what's right with them. And again, it is whatever those are. And that's why we have to develop that resiliency lens, the ability to see the strength, because we live in a deficit-focused culture. So for somebody to come in and say, but I see this is right, and this is right, and this is right, it's the most powerful thing you can do. People know what's wrong with them. So yes, maybe you have to add a finer point that would give them some useful information. But usually what they need is to know what is right with them. So that's the way the resiliency chart works. And we will do this in a little more detail. But it's the idea that on the left-hand side of the page, you identify 3 or 4 challenges. And then on the right-hand side of the page, you identify every strength, both within the person and within their environment, that is pulling them towards resiliency. Every strength pulling them towards resiliency. So maybe if you're taking notes, you can underline that, identify every strength within the person and within the environment that's pulling them to resiliency. And finally, before we leave the resiliency chart, one of the most important questions that you can ask is, how is this person doing as well as they're doing? So let's take the jail example. There are some people who would believe that the worst possible outcome for somebody would be they would wind up in jail. So for that person, the idea of identifying how they're doing as well as they're doing, they might say, well, they're in jail, they're not doing well. And yet in my mind, the people that are coming to Harry and Dana's groups and are participating, that's a huge strength. Yes, they're in jail, but they're participating in a resiliency group, in a healing group, in a path to getting them to a better life. That's huge. So you can find strength in the worst circumstances. I had a community social worker who was doing this chart years ago say to me, my boy is at rock bottom. I don't see any strengths at all. And I said, well, tell me about your boy. And he said, well, he's living out in the fields. This was actually training in Sacramento, California. And this community social worker was working with an 18-year-old boy who was homeless, living in the fields around Sacramento. So again, even in the social worker's mind, that's the worst. He's rock bottom. There's nothing positive for the right-hand side of the page. And I said to that community social worker, how long has he been out there? And that community social worker said, he's been out there several weeks. And I said, I wouldn't last several nights in the fields. What are the strengths within this young man that are allowing him to survive homeless in the fields around Sacramento, California? Imagine the resourcefulness. Imagine the perseverance. Imagine the grit that this teenager is demonstrating to survive out there. Plus, he had an ongoing relationship of caring and support with the community social worker. You can always find strengths in the midst of adversity, and those strengths are what's going to pull people out. So there is a list of what I call personal resiliency builders, to put it in more conversational tone. But again, from the research, these are individual protective factors that facilitate resiliency. So when we do the resiliency chart, which we will do, one of the things I ask folks to do is look down this list. This is a synthesis from all of these hundreds of studies. What are personal qualities that help people to bounce back? And you notice I have menu pretty prominently at the top. And the reason I have menu at the top is because this is a menu. None of us have all of these. All of us have some of these. So let's take what Roberta shared about what helped her in one of the worst pieces of adversity any of us can imagine experiencing, that she went through this past summer. What did she share in just 2 or 3 minutes? We can glean that she used her relationships ability. That's a personal quality. She's built these relationships. They were there for her. She used them when she needed them. My guess is that her work, being of service, has also helped her in the last few months during this difficult time. Being of service is a huge resiliency builder. We know that she used her life skills, including, she talked about boundaries, but also her life skills of going out and seeking the help that she needed, finding the help she needed, and then putting it into absolute practice in her life. My guess is that she had to base her choices in that terrible situation on her own inner direction. When you go through a hard time, people have tons of pieces of advice for you. You need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this. My guess is that Roberta went right into her own inner core and based her decisions on her own internal evaluation. And we won't go through the whole list, but I'm just noticing her love of learning. She turns on YouTube. She says to herself, I'm going to find some ways. I'm going to learn some new ways to cope with this horrible thing that's happened to me. And perseverance, keeping on. These are all qualities. The reason this list is so important is I encourage you to have it handy. So when you're talking with whoever you're working with, be it somebody who's 11 years old or much older, an individual or a family, you can help them see these research-based qualities that they're using. I guarantee you, no matter how dire the circumstances, people are using these. And in almost every case, they have no idea. They have absolutely no idea that they have these, that they're using them, that that's how they're doing as well as they're doing. How do we grow the power of individual protective factors? Provide opportunity to use strengths. Provide opportunity to use strengths. If you're in a situation where all you can do is encourage, then encourage. Encourage those strengths to be used. And then teach people about their strengths. Again, I'm coming back to Roberta's story. I feel a lot of nurture in this house. I feel a lot of care in this house. You two are surviving this adversity together. Teach people about their strengths, name them specifically in real world language that they can understand. And then number 4 is so important. Be an alternate believing mirror. 2 other iconic resiliency researchers wrote this fabulous book. It's still very relevant. It's called The Resilient Self: How Survivors and Families Rise Above Adversity. It's by Steve and Sybil Wolin. Steve's a psychiatrist, Sybil is a psychologist. They're retired now. They were pioneers in resiliency research. And what they found in their research is that resilient people could name an alternate believing mirror. Often it's just one. An alternate believing mirror, somebody who's not saying, and you did this wrong, and you have this diagnosis, and you have this problem, and you've gone through this struggle, and you've got to figure out how to do this. An alternate believing mirror does exactly what Roberta did with the couple whose house she walked into. An alternate believing mirror says, I see what's right here. I see what's right about you. Again, with all the populations that you all have discussed, I don't think you can do this too much, to be honest with you. My guess is that your folks are getting lots of mirroring about what is wrong with them. I mean, let's face it, just being in jail itself is a huge mirror. And unfortunately, it's not a positive mirror. So, you know, being on food stamps, having to have your kids get free lunch, so many ways our culture tells people there's all of this that's wrong with you. You know, I'm going to do a little editorializing here. I live in a community in Southern Oregon where, like many places, there's a huge homeless population. And on the community discussion forum, so many people say, why don't those folks that are sleeping in a tent in the park just go get a job? And I think about how much mirroring these folks have internalized about all of their problems, all of their weaknesses, all of their deficits. And then you're supposed to just rise up from that and go out into a competitive work situation and then get a job. There's just so little compassion in that statement. What is empowering are messages from an alternate believing mirror. My guess is everybody in this training can name one or two or three people or circumstances that were that for them. That was an alternate believing mirror. In my case, I've shared, I was raised in a family with two alcoholic parents. Some of you who know the ACEs 10-point quiz, I have 9 out of 10 ACEs. But I also had amazing believing mirrors. My grandparents, my aunt and uncle, school, all the people in school. So I scored really high on ACEs, and I scored really high on every resiliency quiz or test or assessment I've ever seen, because I had so much of this. Finally, teach people about resiliency, about the fact that social science research has validated over and over and over again this capacity we have for bouncing back. This capacity we have for bouncing back. It is part of what it means to be a human being. We have the capacity, but that doesn't mean you're supposed to do it by yourself. That doesn't mean you pull yourself up by the bootstraps. What that means is the capacity is there. And then we're going to put into your environment the factors that make that more likely to happen. I want to introduce another concept here. I don't know if any of you are facing the challenges of people are tired of hearing about resiliency. They don't think that it's a concept people want to discuss anymore. They feel like it's kind of passé. One of the important ways that you can counter that is the idea that resiliency factors are also the same factors that promote healthy human development. Everybody needs to hear this. These factors are what helps people do well in life. So that's another way to reframe it. And again, this is from Dr. Master and Dr. Barnes. Now, this is their academic article. And what they say is that investigators often draw this distinction between promotive factors and protective factors. But basically, what's coming out of resiliency research is that protective factors are promotive factors are protective factors. The same things that help people be resilient help all of us do well. promotive and protective factors matter. And they also talk about the consistency of the findings across, and again, I'm going to repeat myself, across populations, across problems, across circumstances. Consistency of findings, the same factors over and over and over again, help people bounce back. So there are these individual protective factors, and there are environmental protective factors. And these work together to help people bounce back. So I talked about Roberta's story about how she relied on her individual protective factors of relationships and self-motivation and love of learning to get new skills that she needed. And down that list, she relied on those, and she relied on the environmental resiliency builders in her life. So these are things that come up across studies that help people bounce back. And most of them are self-explanatory. And I'm going to give you a minute just to look down the list. Boundaries comes up as really, really important. And heaven knows, if you're ill, if you're grieving, if you're in any kind of stressful situation, the need to enforce clear boundaries is even more crucial. The caring, the service. And at the very, very bottom of this hierarchy is this idea that maybe the most important thing you can do is help people meet their basic needs for housing and employment and healthcare. So you may need to start there. You look at this list and do as much as you can. And one of the ways that I have facilitated this is to put that list of environmental protective factors into this model called the resiliency wheel. Now, I love it that Jessica and Brief have taken my wheel and put it into a fun, user-friendly format. I'm going to talk from this more research-based format for a minute. Caring and support, I cannot emphasize how important it is. If you do nothing but connect people to more caring and support, you've done a huge service to their resiliency. Caring and support. And then I believe in you. High expectations. We're going to figure this out. And we're going to figure it out together. This is not a situation where I'm telling you what to do. You're going to participate in the strategies, in the goals, and whatever we're talking about in terms of next steps for you. Positive bonds connected to caring and support across the literature, a bond to anything that's positive, anything. So again, you may have to be that sleuth. Is there anything that's positive? I remember a woman coming up to me in McAllen, Texas, years and years ago. And she was a middle school teacher, and she was very worried about this boy because he came from a family of generational gang involvement. What that meant was his great-grandfather and his grandfather and his father were all gang members. And this little boy, she could see, even at age 12 and 13, him being pulled in that direction of gang involvement. And so I said to her, what is he interested in? What is pro-social that he is interested in? This is the funniest answer. She said, well, the number one thing I can think of is he's interested in dinosaurs. And I said, good, make his life about dinosaurs. Give him every project you can connected to dinosaurs. Get him going to any museum, any expert, online for research projects. Surround this boy with dinosaur information. What you want to do then is find that spark for this boy, surrounded by all of this environmental risk, The spark was dinosaurs. So find that spark and increase the connection. For lots of kids, it's animals. Lots of people, it's animals, actually. There's a lot of interesting research about the positive benefits of having animals. But even if that child or that individual can't have animals, they can go to the animal shelter, they can walk the dogs, they can research animals, they can, whatever it might be, find that spark. And then we've talked about the need for boundaries, and finally, life skills. Your client, your students, your own self may find, as Roberta tragically did this summer, you need some more life skills. This individual or family you're helping needs some more life skills. They're thrust into this awful adversity. It might be very sudden, and they need more life skills. In Roberta's case, she shared with us, how do I keep my mind from just going over and over and over and over? That's a life skill. There may be other life skills. Perhaps you're working with folks that need employment. They don't have a clue about how to write a resume. They don't have a clue about how to get a job. If you're working with kindergartners, they don't know how to stand in line. They don't know how to raise their hand. You're the expert. You assess what are the life skills needed in this situation for these folks that you are working with. And then we have to go to Jessica's fun resiliency wheel. I love it. There's a better version I'm aware of, actually, that I've seen in more recent iterations of this diagram, where caring and support has little hearts on it. And the reason is that caring and support is the most powerful of all of these environmental resiliency builders. But this is a way that you can share this information with every kind of audience. And I just applaud you, Jessica, for taking the academic version and putting it into this fun and user-friendly version. The resiliency wheel, pull it out. Think about the folks you're working with. How can you build these environmental protective factors? And again, realize that the individual protective factors and the environmental protective factors interact with each other. So Roberta had to use some of her individual to get to some of the environmental. The environmental will often help the individual. They work together. People bounce back because of the interaction between their individual and the environmental protective factors. All right. To summarize, the 4 most important steps to fostering resiliency. And I've talked about this. There is nothing more important than resiliency attitude. I should add resiliency eyeballs on here too. Being able to walk into a situation and seeing the strength. Communicating, you matter to me. I'm not judging you based on anything you've done in your past, any diagnosis, any way that you've been categorized or boxed in or limited. I believe in your capacity to overcome. And then you work from that strengths perspective. You use that resiliency chart, which we're going to get into a little more in depth in a few minutes. And you ask, what on the strength side of the chart can be used to intervene with the problems? Teach people about their strengths, name them, share how they're being used, suggest how they can be used in the future. Create a protective web. Use the resiliency wheel. And finally, it's a process over time. So one of the other iconic resiliency researchers, Dr. Emmy Werner, she was called the grandmother of resiliency. She and her colleague, Ruth Smith, conducted a 40-year longitudinal resiliency research study on the island of Kauai. And Dr. Werner has passed on now, but I was so blessed to interact with her and to hear her speak. And her favorite saying was, mind these 3, TTT, hear their chime, things take time. And that's what's so distressing about people's myth around what it means to tell someone to be resilient. often in that communication, it's this like snap to and be resilient. That's just not the way it happens. It is a process over time. So let me conclude with what I stuck in for the Essex County, and I want to make sure I'm getting the exact title right, the Essex County Mental Health Community Services Board meeting last June. I connected resiliency to building mental health. So the World Health Organization defines mental health as a state of being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to the community. In this positive sense, mental health is the foundation for individual well-being and the effective functioning of the community. That's what resiliency does, fostering resiliency, an individual realizing their own abilities, giving them the life skills and the support to cope with the normal stresses of life, surrounding them with that resiliency wheel and whatever that might need to work productively, and offering, encouraging, facilitating the ability to make a contribution. So there, in my mind, there is no daylight between fostering resiliency and fostering mental health. And I indicate that these strategies are embedded in the resiliency wheel and the resiliency workbook. And they're all based on decades of research about how people of all ages, cultures, and ethnic groups bounce back. So this is a quote from Harry that I stuck in for the Essex County Community Mental Health Board. He talks about how he's used the resiliency workbook material in the Wednesday mental health group sessions. He says the material has been a huge hit. And he talks about how, and he, again, in the meeting I attended with him, talked about how group members share in meaningful dialogue their life experiences from that resiliency perspective. It allows them to share at a deep level. And I'm adding my own editorial here. It removes some of that stigma of shame. So you may need to emphasize when you're having conversations and dialogue, the connection between the resiliency strategies and strategies to facilitate mental health. Again, they are one and the same. At the end of my basic presentations, I emphasize whatever group I'm talking to, the power of one person. So I'm going to conclude by emphasizing that today. Over and over and over again, the resiliency research emphasizes the power of one person. So many folks have been resilient. When they are interviewed, when the researchers ask, how was it that you bounced back? They talk about one person, one opportunity, sometimes it's even a single interaction. We don't validate for ourselves the power that we all have. And this too should be a part of your resiliency dialogue. The power of one person. Before I knew resiliency information, I used to think, I was a community social worker. I used to think, geez, these kids in this group I'm running, they live in poverty, they live in abuse, they live in gang-infested neighborhoods. What good am I? I said that to myself over and over and over again before I found resiliency. And this research just shoots that out of the water. The power of one person is huge. You are that person. And that's something that you can communicate when you are dialoguing about resiliency to anyone who is in a service field where they're working with folks that are struggling, or they're teaching students that are struggling. The power of one person comes up over and over and over again, and you are that person. So with that, I'm going to stop our share for now. And I'm going to ask you to take a moment and do some writing. Oh, hi, Harry. You heard me quote you a lot. Okay, take a moment and do some writing. And there's Tracy too.
I'm honored. Good to see everybody's smiling face.
Here's the first question. What did you get from that presentation that you can use immediately? It might be in your personal life. It might be in your professional life. It might be in both places. What did you get that you can use immediately?
I wish I could be the one to give you the answer right now.
Well, we're going to get everybody to give an answer. So just hang on.
Cool.
And you'll have a chance. I'm going to give you just another minute. What did you get that you can use immediately?
Well, I just jumped on like Harry, so I heard you say the power of one, right? So just reminding myself that I could be that one for somebody in the, in the fast-paced world of, working and doing all the things we need to do. Just to slow down and know that things that we speak, I could be the power of one, and there is a power of one in my life that continues to be a beacon of hope, which is my grandma.
That was mine too.
Yes.
This is my life.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I'm gonna correct you a little bit, Tracy. Not that you could be, you are.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Miss Roberta's great story of walking into this home where this couple had a child in Head Start and the couple was facing enormous challenges. And what Roberta immediately did was to talk about the strengths that she saw there. We underestimate that power. But those of us who are resiliency ambassadors, we do this all the time, and it's extremely powerful. So somebody else, how can you use this immediately? And maybe it's the way you've already been using it. It doesn't have to be new. How can you use this immediately?
I like the idea of being able to say we're not preaching positivity, because that turns a lot of people off, because when you're really dark, thinking positive is the last thing you can or you want to do.
Right.
But it's inadvertently channeling all the ways to find the positive without, looking for this snarky butterfly in the meadow kind of deal.
Let me refer you to Stephen Sybil Wolin, their book, The Resilient Self. What they emphasize, and I didn't mention it, so I'm glad you brought this up, Emma. What they emphasize is that in your interactions, when people are suffering, you don't immediately jump in with the positive. It's on the back end. It's after you've empathized and validated. In some cases, you might have to normalize that pain, and you acknowledge it. That pain is real. I mean, as somebody who has 9 out of 10 on the ACEs scale, I have enormous wounds. That pain is real, but I am also amazingly resilient. So both of those things exist at the same time. The pain is real. The resilience is real. Okay, somebody else. Either how you are using that or how you can use it immediately. Something from that presentation.
I'll go. So just last night, we did a community conversations about mental health and preventing addiction. And we did a resiliency piece, and we really talked about the power of one person. That caring and support was, the most important on the wheel. And to get the audience to engage, we gave examples, and the power of one person, in that caring and support really could be a wide variety. So some people said family, their friend, there's a neighbor. I think in the jail, somebody said I get to shadow a couple of times, Harry and Dana, and it's wonderful. But somebody said their 90-year-old neighbor. And just really, identifying that on stage and to the audience of it really can be anybody, including, I had one young girl say it was the bagger at the grocery store. So just really knowing who the power of one person can be. It can be anybody.
I've had people say it was their parole or probation officers. So the bus driver, the school custodian. Yes, it's a very empowering message. We have this power. And there's also this myth that sometimes it has to be somebody that you have a relationship with for years and years and years. For those of us with the grandmothers, we did have that. But for some people, it can be a brief relationship as well. So, okay, how can you use this immediately?
I'd like to think that we could ourselves emanate compassion and non-judgment toward others. So instead of teaching this, be it.
Yeah.
And model it. We can be broken. We can make mistakes, be human, and to, just totally 100% accept somebody. They see it, whether they may not see it in body language. Sometimes there can be an energy that people can feel, and they don't know what it is, but it's comforting to them. So, that's, in my opinion, the best way that you can preach positivity.
And also, in a way, it's that you are the embodiment of the resiliency attitude. Sometimes you're just being there. And it's almost like, again, it's this paradox where all of the diagnoses, all of the problems, all of the adversity, we have to acknowledge it, it's real, but we have to hold it a little bit lightly because it's not the whole story. I was in a church discussion group lately, and they were asking me about my work. It was a new group, so one of the things that came out of my mouth is that people are far more than their wounds. And this woman, she was like, I don't know, in her 60s or 70s, and she said, I've never thought of that before. People are far more than their wounds. Again, that's a basic tenet of the resiliency approach. People are far more than their wounds. And if you believe that and embody that, then you carry that with you wherever you go. So you're absolutely right. Anybody else want to share a way they can use this? Will use this? Something that came up in the basic presentation?
For me,
Stephanie?
It's a reminder to support grandparents. In Essex County, we have an extra high percentage of grandparents raising their grandchildren. And by supporting them, we're helping those kids be more resilient.
I want to do another brief shout out here. I attended a meeting a couple of months ago, community meeting, where all of the communities in your county were represented, and they basically did an assessment of all the ways that caring and support show up around the county. And I was just amazed at sometimes tiny little ideas. So I don't remember the name of the community, but in a community center in one of the communities, for example, they had, it was either a laptop or an iPad available for people to use. And they were talking about how so many, particularly seniors, would come in and use that. I mean, talk about a link to caring and support through a pretty simple intervention. That's just one example that stood out in my mind. So I think there's also a myth that we have to do big, huge things to make a major difference. And yet there are little things that we can do that offer support. And so I hope this has kind of generated thinking about those little things as well. Anybody else, how you could use this, how you are using this information? Questions, any questions about this basic resiliency information?
So I have a question.
Good.
About protective factors. So this is a challenge when I'm out, doing trainings, is explaining protective factors or getting people to understand protective factors. And we're not talking just one age range. We're talking from like elementary, middle school, high school, up to elderly. How can we explain protective factors at various ages? So that has been a good challenge of mine. And I know you touched base on it, and I would love to see, how this works. Like, how do you do this with different ages?
Jessica, did you get the resiliency quiz for elementary school children?
I did.
So that elementary school counselor years ago in Pennsylvania took the resiliency quiz and put it, I thought, in really good language for younger kids. So I would start there. I would look at his expertise because he was an elementary school counselor. And then what I found is that if I have conversations about with the kids, sometimes they'll come up with the brightest ideas and they'll say, "Oh, you mean it's like this?" And I'll go, "Yeah, that's exactly what it's like," because I cannot pretend to understand the vernacular of middle school or high school kids. But again, calling them bounce back factors, resiliency factors, overcoming factors, and then ask them, give me some more ideas. What's some more language? When I'm at a loss as to how to do something with a group of people, I turn it back to them and I say, help me out here. Help me to understand how I can talk about this so that's more, more easily assimilated, more easily understood by people that are in high school, by people who are in middle school. So I would ask the kids themselves. I always ask the kids. A few years ago, I was asked to go into New York schools, New York City. They wanted me to go into the schools labeled persistently dangerous in New York City school system. So the school system had this label, they called them PD schools. And they wanted me to go in and work with the staff. And I said, I'll only work with the staff if we equally include the students, equally include the young people. So that's always one of my rules of thumb. Always include the population that you're working with. And I can't believe out of the mouths of these babes, these little 8, 9, and 10-year-olds were telling the staff, but this is what we need, and this is what we need. And the staff were like, oh, we never thought of that before. So that would be a short answer, Jessica, is kind of talk around it and then see what kinds of terms the particular group comes up with that you're working with.
Thank you.
I have an idea. Well,
good.
So I have a staff who works in the schools, and she is in love with Winnie the Pooh and all the characters of Winnie the Pooh. And so she has shirts, and I mean, you can, and then social media, like there's these beautiful sayings, but we've adopted Tigger as our mascot for resiliency. And so when we're in schools, and our prevention counselors actually use as part of, so our prevention counselors, who we call resiliency coaches, they're not clinical people. They don't have a clinical education, but they do part of our system of care
the Office of Addiction and Support Services, we are required to do assessments. And so we slide in the resiliency. So the resiliency quiz, that is part of our assessment and part of our action planning and goal planning. And so that is our therapeutic modality to for relational growth.
You know, I love that, because you said something really important, Tracy. You slide it in. Yeah. So this is another strategy.
Sneak it in.
I learned years ago. Whatever it is you're asked to present on, whatever it is you're asked to consult on, you can slide it in. And Stephanie and her colleagues just did this great presentation for the New York State, I forget the name of the organization, Stephanie, the system.
The New York State Trauma Informed Network and Resource Center.
Oh my God, they slid it in. They talked about making a resiliency sandwich and trauma-informed care, where you talk about resiliency and then you focus on the trauma-informed and then you talk about resiliency. In your case, Tracy, you just talked about putting that quiz in. You just put it in. And if people are needing X, Y, or Z, they need life skills training, they need social emotional learning, they need to know how to set classroom boundaries, whatever it might be, you just slide it in. And that's another beauty of the resiliency research and the resiliency model. You can slide it in anywhere. I've not found a place you can't slide it in. So I love that. And the other point that Tracy made that's so important, if you're in a conversation with a group or a person or an organization, and they're really focused on one thing, like New York State, a lot of the state agencies are really focused on trauma-informed practice. So that's fine. You take trauma-informed practice and you connect it to resiliency. You take social emotional learning and you connect it to resiliency. You take classroom management and you connect it to resiliency. If you look at that wheel, you can connect it to anything. Any positive organization, any positive program, any positive strategy, you can connect it to anything. And that's another way. And one of the things I had on the agenda was the need to potentially reframe. So people think they're sick of hearing about resiliency. Good, reframe it. Talk about effective classroom management. Talk about effective ways of addiction treatment that are strength-based. Whatever it is, you can slide it in and you can connect with what that particular organization is passionate about. Okay, other comments, questions? We are going to take a break. I'm only going to do 5 minutes. And then we're going to come back and we're going to do that resiliency chart in depth. We're going to look at the resiliency workbook. We're going to talk about resiliency and trauma-informed practice, resiliency in the workplace, and next steps. So let's see, I'm on a completely different time than you all are. So let's do a 7-minute break. Let's do my time. Well, let's just come back at 10 minutes till. And then I don't have to get into the fact it's still morning here and it's afternoon there. So let's come back.
2:50 p.m.
2:50 p.m. We'll come back. Let's just take a quick break and we'll get into the rest of it then. See you in 7 minutes.
Hey, Emma, welcome. It's nice to see you in this context. Oops, you're on mute. Oh, you're muted. We can't hear you, Emma. But I think you're saying something nice. So it's good to hear you and see you. Yay. Okay. You're off of mute now.
I don't know what I did. Oh, I shrunk the whole thing. Oh, my Zoom disappeared. And
well, high five.
Okay. So we're going to do the resiliency chart. It's something that I kind of go over pretty quickly, but I'm going to ask all of you to work a little bit here. And I want you to think about somebody in your life. So I think I have it right up here. Oh, no, I don't. Somebody in your life that you want to work on at this moment. And we're going to do a resiliency chart with them. There it is. So it's somebody you're concerned about and somebody that you don't necessarily see a resilient outcome with, if you're honest. We're going to have you take out a piece of paper and you're going to do some sharing in small groups with this. So write the name of that person, or it could be a family on the line there. And it's completely okay to be in this place where you're saying to yourself, well, I know this is resiliency training and it's also positive, but I'll tell you, this person is really struggling and I just do not see the resiliency. That's the very person we want to utilize this with. So write their name on the left hand, up on the line, and then on the left hand side of the page, I want you to write the top 3 or 4 reasons you're concerned about this individual or this family. Top 3 or 4 reasons you're concerned. So I already briefly talked about this with the family that Roberta mentioned. Concerns might be, and there are concerns within the individual or the family and the environment. So concerns might be the poverty. There may be some dysfunction in the family. There may be substance abuse, maybe not addiction, but abuse. There may be self-esteem issues. There may be a lack of motivation, depression. Depending on the age of the individual, it could be anything. What are the top 3 or 4 reasons you're concerned about this individual or this family? And this is the easy part. We're kind of indoctrinated in our training to look at problems, and that's okay. We have to do that. The next part is hard. I almost feel like we're having to activate brain cells that are dormant. The next part is the right-hand side of the page. And I want you to think like you have never thought about this individual or this family. And you're going to identify strengths like Roberta did when she walked in and she smelled the cooking. That's such a great example. What are strengths? Even if you've just seen a glimmer. So maybe let's just take a high school student. So maybe this high school student isn't helpful to his classmates all the time, but you have seen that quality, that altruism, that helpfulness. You've seen him reaching out when somebody really needs some assistance, some support, some comfort. I want you to think of every possible thing within the individual that is a strength. Every possible thing. Again, it doesn't have to be in full perfect manifestation. You may not have seen it all the time. You may have only seen it occasionally, but it's like the sun behind the storm clouds. It does peek out. Individual qualities. Think about how is this person doing as well as they're doing. Maybe they were only motivated once, but that motivation was there and it got them a really important connection. Individual qualities. And then within the environment, think about that resiliency wheel. Where is their caring? Where is their support? It might be an unlikely source. It might be the bus driver. It might be the bagger at the grocery store. It might be the 90-year-old neighbor down the street. Where is there any caring and support in that person's life? Where do they receive high expectations that they can succeed? Where is their pro-social bonding? Positive connections, an interest in dinosaurs, an interest in pets, an interest in fixing bicycles, pro-social bonding. Think of that wheel, think of where they might get any of that wheel. And again, the question that keeps bringing out more is, how is it this person is doing as well as they're doing? How is it this person is doing as well as they're doing? So I hope all of you have your resiliency workbooks with you. On page 16 is the list that we're looking for of the personal resiliency builders. And this is such a good list to have with you as a reminder about what might be going on in the lives of this family or this individual. So, yeah, it looks like everybody's back. Here's my first question to anybody who wants to answer. What's it like just talking about somebody's strengths? What's that experience like, talking about strengths, particularly strengths of people that you're working to help?
It feels good. It's empowering.
Humbling.
What? Okay, empowering. What'd you say, Harry?
Humbling. Very humbling.
Humbling.
Mhm.
Anybody else? I'd like to talk about people's strengths.
I think it's uplifting. It puts you in a better mood to talk about the positive, like the good things about other people. Because then you're like, I'm around good people instead of I'm around not good people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, I am aware of the term toxic positivity, but that doesn't mean we need to erase all positive. It means we need to be very cognizant and aware of pain and wounds and scars. But these strengths are real, and that's what gets people out. So, okay, any realization that you had in this process, any realization as you did this chart?
Go ahead, Emma.
I thought it was going to be a lot easier to come up with the strengths. I'm like, oh, it's easy to talk about strengths, but then I was defaulting to like finding the good and bad things. Like there's a glimmer of good, but like, because it's personally connected to me, I'm still seeing like all the after. So I was like trying to snip it off so that I like, cause there's still strengths. It's just cause you have to teach somebody to inflate those. So,
you know,
that's
such an honest and good comment. We almost feel guilty talking about strengths. If somebody has a whole bunch of problems, it feels somehow like we're violating some kind of code. If we talk about their strengths, we're supposed to just focus on those problems, focus on those problems. No, you got to look at those problems. It's the problems, not the strengths. And we're all having to overcome that programming. Does that make sense to folks? And yet, the strengths are what pull people out. So, Jessica, you had a comment.
I was going to say it's really easy for us to focus on all the negatives and not the positives. Like it actually takes an effort to focus on strengths and
yes,
to, not see the red and to see the green.
It takes willpower. I was at this conference in Pennsylvania years ago, And actually I was on a panel with Ann Maston, who's one of my heroes, and other resiliency researchers. And we were all asked, what's it going to take for this model, this paradigm to really catch fire? And my answer was willpower. It takes willpower. I find myself, as I drive by the middle school here in this little town I live, and I notice the kids out in the back smoking, my first default is not to drinks, believe me. My first default is all the negative things we know about the kids in the back of the school that are smoking. And it takes willpower. If I had them in front of me, it would take willpower to keep focused on not just the problems, but also the strengths that are the lifeline. So, any other comments about this, Stephanie?
Well, on that, so many of you know that we work with a curriculum called Mind Up that teaches partly about neuroscience and neuroplasticity and the power of like taking a brain break, they call it. But what's part of the curriculum is explaining to children that our brains are programmed like for survival reasons to see the risk, to see the danger, which makes our amygdala like woo danger, which is always very helpful. So it's actually now part of like neuroplasticity science to retrain your brain to that we have a bias, you know, like it's a mental bias towards the danger, towards the risk.
Right.
So it's
the bias.
But it's possible, right? Like anything with neuroplasticity, like you can retrain your brain.
Right. And when we were hunters gatherers cave people, we needed to really be aware of all of that danger 24/7, most likely. But now it's almost like the record in the brain gets stuck on that groove. Of course, I'm old enough to remember records, but yeah. What happens for me, and as you do training and have these discussions, what might happen for you, once I start allowing people to talk about strengths, either for themselves or for other folks, it's almost like the lid comes off. I can't get people in trainings to stop talking about strengths. It's like they've waited their whole lives to talk about strengths. And you may find that as you dialogue with folks, or you may find the other thing, which is when you try to be that positive mirror and reflect strengths back to people, their first response is going to be, not me. That's part of that barrier that Roberta talked about. So many of the folks we work with have to go through this world with this incredibly strong barrier they've put up just to survive. So when we start talking about strengths, we're literally asking them to let that barrier down a bit and to let that feedback in. So my other piece of advice is persist. Don't give up. So many times I can remember saying, well, you may not see this, but I see this. And if you can give specifics, I see this. I see what you did last night on the basketball court. I saw your teamwork. I saw your perseverance. I saw your grit. We're going to take those strengths and we're going to use them now for your math class. You have this stuff. I saw it. So if you can give evidence, I'm thinking particularly of one person I worked with. This was a 13-year-old girl, and all the time I would try to be sharing strengths with her. She would go, nuh-uh, 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 nuh-uh. So again, you can acknowledge that and say, you may not see it, but I see it. And you just hang in there with the strengths. The resiliency chart is something that you can also use with an organization. So let's say that, and I did this with the New York Persistently Dangerous Schools. I put that chart up and I said, okay, what are the main problems here? And then we looked at the strengths. And I'm remembering one school where what I learned is the way you got the persistently dangerous label in New York City schools was if you had a lot of acting out behavior where kids had to be suspended or they had to be in any way dealt with because of their acting out behavior. So then they got the label persistently dangerous. So I went into this school on Staten Island that had the label persistently dangerous. And that school had more strengths than most schools that I've been in. And I've been in a lot of schools. The principal, I think, was clinically depressed. So that wasn't a strength, obviously. But she was depressed because her school had a PD on it. And that's the problem with labels. Labels narrow the way we look at something into this small little box. So that's the only thing that people knew about this school. So when I started asking about strengths, they said to me, well, we have a really active parent community here. We have parents that are coming up every Saturday. We have more parent volunteers than we know what to do with. That is such a huge strength in schools. Any of you who know schools? And the other thing they said to me was that their staff, despite their union contracts, basically put in tons of overtime. They basically said, we don't care about the union contract as much as we care about the kids. So the parents were involved, the staff was involved, and they have this student council of these kids that I basically used a fishbowl and had the staff around the sides of the room and the kids in the middle giving the staff their perspective on what the school needed. And all the staff was just flabbergasted at these 10 and 11-year-olds and their wisdom and saying stuff like, we need more school counselors. And if we don't have school counselors, then we could have basically resiliency coaches, and we just need more of the caring adults in here. And the reason kids are acting out is they don't know any better. So they need social and emotional learning. And these were the kids, 10 and 11-year-olds telling the staff this. This was a school that had this terrible label and had these enormous strengths, completely unrecognized. So I bring this up because you can use the resiliency chart in organizations in the exact same way. All right.
Can I add one more thing about that?
Yeah.
That brief meeting that you reflected on, Nan, where Harry was there and Jessica was there.
Yes.
Where we have like this resiliency map. It takes the wheel, it starts with like the individual and then the family and school, organization, and community. And when we mapped out, we spent the session most of the time talking about community resilience. People talked about these things in their communities that provide caring and support and these other strengths. And people could not stop talking. It was like they'd never been asked. Not like what's wrong with your community, but like what are all the things?
Meeting I was at.
Yeah, you were at. Yeah, we have a library. We have like Penelope the clown who like provides caring and support. We've got, this. We've got our Lions Club. And it was like, and this infinite list of resiliency builders, and that people just almost got the feeling didn't get a chance to talk about much.
Yeah, I was in that meeting. I was blown away by the number of strengths and the ideas that were shared between communities. I just thought that was phenomenal, Stephanie. And let me share this for any of you who are feeling, oh, I should have done more resiliency training. I feel so bad. I have never presented this to an audience that didn't just eat it up. I mean, just the strengths focus alone, as Stephanie pointed out, and I've shared my experiences, people just love it. They love to identify strengths. They love to go around that wheel and identify what they have going on in each of those segments. They love that validation. So there isn't any reason why you have to be concerned that people won't want this information. People love this information. That's been my experience. All right, let's talk for a minute about the resiliency workbook. And I hope all of you have your workbooks, but the resiliency workbook is another way you can share this information. It's a curriculum, and you can easily do almost a self-governed resiliency workbook group. So Stephanie, I'm going to put you on the spot. You put me on the spot at that community meeting. I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute. Can you just talk for a minute about the workbook groups that you did and what they were like for people?
Yeah, sure. So shortly after going through your training of trainers, Kelly Ganji and I, who's one of the participants in that, trainers, and we ran a couple of cycles of community of like discussion groups based on the resiliency workbook. So we made sure everybody had one, anybody could sign up. It was mostly service providers. There were some community members, and we'd go through, I think we did 6 sessions to cover the whole book. So we go through a couple chapters, and then we dig in, and there would be a lot of discussion. And that was when I got I think I realized, like, that's why I felt comfortable going to Harry's group at the Mental Health Association and doing a couple of those exercises with him and handing out the books. And I was really surprised, like, people want these. This is cool, because I saw that, like, I had already seen that dynamic, and the workbook makes it so easy. Like, you just it creates a dialogue. So anybody can do that. It's really cool. You don't need special training. It's a great way to internalize the information. And yeah. I'm going to put a link in the chat, because it's possible not everybody here knows that Nan recorded it on audio for us, and you can download all those worksheets with those interactive questions. So we did it online, but you can do it in person. Obviously, they're doing it in the jail.
I'm excited to utilize that audio in the jail this next time around too, with the next class that's coming up. So I'm excited for that.
Harry, I was going to call on you next. Will you share some about the workbook groups you're doing at the jail? Just any experiences with it.
I mean, I'll go back, with MHA, we started first, like April when Steph, actually, or March, it may have been earlier this year, with kind of bringing it to my attention. And I read through it and was obviously blown away with some, not as the complexity, but simplicity. It's the oxymoron, but it's, how smooth it was, I guess. And the delivery of it, and how with the people that we've had since obviously getting back face to face with COVID, that it was an answer to that. And a lot of the people that we have are isolated and mental health issues that, just are screaming for it. So it was nice to have something of a curriculum that kind of just plopped on my, being a teacher, administrator in the past, in the educational world, it's one of those things that kind of helps with the human health services field to really, link it. And it's education. It really is. And it's really educating them to things that they already have, those tool sets that are really there, and ultimately empowering them. I mean, that's our mission here, is to encourage, empower, and overcome. And what better way to do that than through the utensil and of through resiliency. I mean, that's what it is. For mental health, you need to be resilient. It's that simple.
It is.
And I stretched it out, from like April to throughout the summer. I'm like, I'm just going to take our time with this and just not have a set start or set end. We kind of would, do events during the summertime and stuff like that, and take, weeks off and stuff like that, and then rejoin it back in and get to reading. And we'd probably only get like through a page, because we'd get into conversation and dialogue through lived life experiences through everybody that's here, 15, 20 people. And it would just be a good, healthy, welcoming environment, non-judgmental environment that just really, it blossomed. And it really was, it bonded the people that were there. The pro-social bonding really just formulated and really just, kind of was nurtured in many ways. And it was awesome. It really was. There's no other way to really kind of see it. It was awesome to be a part of and to facilitate, because it was just natural, and it was just natural to kind of ask the questions and go along with the things. Some of the questions they were like, but others it would go on for, 30 minutes, with a question, because it would go through different things that would spawn different things and algorithm out, and I'm like, okay, let's bring it back. And from then it kind of went into the jail, where we went through with Dana. I think she had to get off, and we did that for the last 8-10 weeks, with a good crew of started with 8, but then it went down to 3, because obviously people get out or they're shifting here and there. So we kind of sped it up towards the end and went through it, but very, very, very good, with a guy that's like I was talking about in the group yesterday, one guy that's been the inmate worker there here in the jail for probably about a year. He did a county bullet, and he's a local guy, got into hard drugs and just, down times, but very hardworking guy, good principled guy, has his wife, who ultimately we have through Care Coordination Services here through MHA. And he's being released this Friday. So I'm going to give him a certificate of completion tomorrow. and you know, he's going to be happy as a clam, and he's going to go back to his wife and his dog, you know, Friday, and be free and resilient. And it's really been, it's been beautiful, you know, just getting into that dialogue and really just kind of getting questions out, what their biggest issues are with boundaries, of course, you know, saying no, you know, and obviously with it more often than not, it's addiction that they're afflicted with, and you know, being able to say no to the people that ultimately get them to go down the wrong path and get them to where obviously they are, and you know, just reinforcing and just kind of being a good listener and letting them tell their story, but ultimately just empowering them and encouraging them to, you know, see that they have the power themselves to really be resilient, to do the things they're doing, and just reassure them, you know.
One of the things you said in the community board meeting last June that I really resonated with was, you said that when people can share through a resiliency lens, somehow being able to talk through that lens allows them to open up more. And my sense, some of the shame is alleviated. Is that
I agree. No, it is. It absolutely is, because I think it goes more to the root of the core of their identity more than anything else. They're allowed to kind of shine at the more core of who they are in many ways, and seeing that at the worst of the worst within a jail setting, you know, they're in stripes, they got clogs, they've got nothing but other than themselves there. And just, you know, like I say, when the word humble, it's to be humbled is to not allow their egos to be involved. So like when Emma and I was talking about our kids at 15 or 12, we've got, or my little baby girl at 3 years old, which is in pure essence of egomania, you know, but it's beautiful because it's innocent, you know. There's that point of where we have to, you know, deal with our own sense of pride in many ways, and balance through a smile and humor, and looking at those protective factors and where they deviate, where they're absent, but they're not fully absent. They just may be dim. They're all just lights that need to be turned on ultimately in some way, in some form. And it made me think actually of my wife's best friend who's going through issues, and has been going through issues for about 40 years of his life of codependency and mental health issues, but he doesn't want to think about medication. He'll go to therapy, but not medicate. And there's a lot of barriers. So, you know, a lot of the things I wrote down when you were talking about with like concerns and strengths, he has humor, he has creativity, he has all these positives that are there in strengths, but he's very, he's very deflective to anything that gets past that superficial point, right? He'll shut off, turn away. It's not my time, you know. And we all have those kind of protective barriers in many ways, and you know, and it's respected, but it's always to the point where even our clinical neuropsych here at MHA says, whenever you're ready, or when are you ready, or whenever you're ready, I'm here to help, you know. And always knowing that I'm a pillar there, even with our veteran that just got released last week or 2 weeks ago. From the class, when the class ended, very articulate guy. He went through actually the first class and said, I read through the whole thing this entire week, read the whole book. And he gave a whole litany. He talked for a good 10 minutes. You know, I mean, a lot of it was a lot of just, I already know this, blah, 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 and yada, yada. But then when we got towards the end, it was like a pretest of what he wrote out to at the end, saying it was really the experience of being together and going through it together and talking together that really made it that substantive. You know what I mean? That gave it substance and gave it more life and more of a tangible thing that he took with him. So, and the great thing is that our supervisor here, who also helps at the jail, helped to bring him to a rehab, a veterans rehab. So my supervisor, veteran, picked him up. He's a veteran and brought him to rehab upon release. So, you know, the resiliency of him breaking apart from a relationship that he always went back to, you know, that brought him down and threw him in jail, that kept throwing him back into the doldrums. And going through this class, it was kind of a light and an awakening of, hey, you've had an IT job, and, you know, a good paying IT job in Florida. You've been successful. You've been in the military. It's time for you to take care of you, and it's okay. You know, it's time to bounce back for you and nobody else.
I want to tap in and kind of brag about Harry for a second, if you don't mind. So I was able to shadow them, the first and the last. And I know the individual he's talking about because he's highly intelligent. And at the end, the very last one, it was, what did you learn? And it was really connecting those dots, right, throughout the book and those protective factors. And he had said with your change model, Nan, he was at relapse. And he had said he was at relapse because he had no place to go. He was homeless. He was too, he had a pride of not using the VA benefits and, he could do this. And to hear that Harry was able to get through that and break through that and get him into that VA support and that he now will have more of a direction than I'm going to relapse and come back because I have no place to go. That right there, Harry, is the resiliency and the caring and support that is really needed. So I really wanted to just give you a spotlight.
Thank you.
High five.
Thank you, friend.
Well, my guess is that Harry, because he has a strength-based approach, because this person knew that he saw more than whatever his mistakes had been, that was one of the ways that connection could be what it was. Am I right about that, Harry? That'd be my guess.
I think you're bullseye, man.
And also,
Absolutely.
I was thinking about how many folks in jail need that boundaries instruction. I once talked with a retired police officer, and I remember he was in Baltimore at a conference I was at. He told me how many times he arrested people who said to him, I knew I should have said no. I knew I should have said no. And I bet you've heard that as well. I knew I couldn't trust this guy. I knew even though he told me there wasn't guns involved, there'd be guns involved. I knew I shouldn't have gone that night. I knew I should have said no. And I just think that's probably a reoccurring theme with the boundaries part in the resiliency wheel. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
One of the best parts of the workbook, Nan actually has exercises about practicing saying no. And it's very practical.
Very practical.
We hit that every week. We hit that every week. That was
that's. I don't want a 20. I want 4 or 5s. No, I don't want a 20. I want 4 or 5s. Yeah, very kind of low stress exercises and practicing how to say no. Yeah.
And honestly, we mimic that. I did that. I've done exercises even here at MHA with those here, kind of in a way that's more role playing of saying no. Of saying, hey, you want to go here? Hey, I want to do this, because you know a lot of our population is easily exploitable. So I mean, the naive, those that are naive and gullibility, and we talk about that, and just the ease of being, swayed in how we capitulate to certain things, and it's, we got to be reminded of it.
Yep. Good. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Stephanie. Before we run out of time, I want to talk about resiliency and trauma-informed care. And one of the things that both these approaches share is the strengths perspective. So the strengths perspective is a cornerstone of trauma-informed care. It's also a cornerstone of resiliency. And so I have the slide again. Stephanie will share this with you. And the idea of putting the strengths and resources of people, communities, and their environments, rather than their problems and pathologies, at the center of the helping process. And that's exactly what we've been talking about all afternoon. It's basically a corrective and transformative challenge to what is still predominant practices that reduce people and their potential to deficits, pathologies, problems, and dysfunctions. That's it in a nutshell. People get reduced to this. This is how they move through the world, and this is not the route to resiliency. The strengths perspective emphasizes the human capacity for strengths, for resilience, resistance, courage, thriving, and ingenuity. And it champions the rights of individuals and communities to form and achieve their own goals and aspirations. While acknowledging the difficulties that clients experience, the strengths perspective never limits people to their traumas, problems, obstacles, illnesses, or adversity. Rather, it addresses them as challenges, opportunities, and motivators for change. The strengths approach. So when you look at trauma-informed care, basically one of the key points is that it is a focus on strengths rather than deficits. So this isn't a trauma-informed care training, but basically trauma-informed care means an incorporation of the awareness of how behaviors and symptoms connect to traumatic experiences. It emphasizes safety, which of course connects to those boundaries, which is a key part of resiliency. It provides an opportunity for people to regain a sense of control, which is a whole purpose of providing the resiliency wheel in their lives. So this is from SAMHSA, 6 Core Principles of Trauma-Informed Care. And I'm just aware of how much this is synonymous with the resiliency wheel, protective factors. These are protective factors. Protective factors are these, and Stephanie's going to talk about this a little more in just a minute. So here's what it means in practice: prioritizing safety, building trust, giving choices and options. Again, there's boundaries, opportunities for meaningful participation, caring and support with the signs and symptoms of the trauma. The collaboration is the high expectations and the opportunities for meaningful participation. Understanding that we have to come and show our caring through cultural humility and client strengths, and a recognition of the historic and collective traumas. That's another way to express our caring and support. So at this point, I want to turn this over to Stephanie for a few minutes, because she's going to share a piece of how she and her colleagues integrated resiliency with trauma-informed care at this New York conference. And I think I took a note on what the conference was, but she can tell you. It was something that she just did this month. A phenomenal presentation. Oh yeah, it's the New York State Trauma-Informed Network and Resource Conference. It was in Lake George, New York. So Stephanie, take it away so we can get a little more of this integration.
Sure, I'm going to try to do this really quick because I, like everyone else, I'm like exhausted. But I do want to just put something in context and also congratulate all of your organizations that are actually participating in this. So all of you, ACAP, Mountain Lake Services, the prevention team, Mental Health Association, everyone who is here, basically, their organization is on here and they've been participating in, like at least a year and a half of ongoing trauma-informed training and practice through a group. But one of the reasons, like, so I'm gonna just skip ahead here, but one of the main reasons we get invited to talk about this a lot is, I'm just skipping ahead, is because we've done something different in Essex County, which is we didn't know we were doing this at the time, but we started with resiliency. Like, we started working with Nan in our system of care, like from the beginning. So I don't know, 2.5 years ago, Nan started training our groups. And so I think of it like this sandwich, essentially. Like, we already had
I love it.
Resiliency, and that's the protective factor. And then we can learn about trauma-informed care, which is really important. And there are some specific things in it that we really do need to know as service providers about being trauma responsive. And then also and then bring it back to the resiliency and the protective factors. Somebody pointed out at this conference that we tend to name things after the problem. So we named it, nobody loves the term trauma-informed care, right?
Yeah.
So it's also reminding you that, but then they also came up with this. I've been trying to find ways to say this, because Nan mentioned, this like burnout on the term resiliency. And what's happened in pop culture is, unfortunately, the definition of resiliency, which is not research-based, is what's being reflected back at us. And you see memes all over Facebook. I snagged this one, but it says, "I dream of never being called resilient again in my life. I'm exhausted by strength. I want support. I want softness. I want ease. I want to be amongst kin, not patted on the back for how well I take a hit or for how many." So that's like assuming only individual resiliency factors. So we reviewed those, right? So I've thought of this like resiliency reframe, and that, yes, like there are 2 ways we bounce back, as Nan said, that there are 2 groups of protective factors, and one are those individual protective factors, and this is the the kind of like stereotype of resiliency that we see. It's like the plant in the desert and all it has is itself. And that is true sometimes, that all we do have is our own persistence or our positive attitude or strength. They're these things that are very real. However, like the other part of the story are that they're environmental protective factors, these external things that are summarized in the resiliency wheel. This is the version that has caring and support highlighted. But that when we encounter like the people, organizations, activities that are, you know, pretty much summed up in the resiliency wheel, then like that, the way I think of it is it creates the conditions in which the individual resiliency factors can emerge. So that reframe has been really powerful. And then I say a little about trauma-informed organizations, that really like trauma-informed organizations, the definition is they create a safe and trusting environment. And essentially like even just looking at caring and support, that's a lot of what that's about. So it's difficult to be a trauma responsive organization or school without that. So anyway, I'll stop that share. But the link to that,
and again,
chat,
this is pioneering work. And the reason I think it's so important is when people talk about trauma-informed practice, what is the main focus? Go back to that strengths slide I had. The main focus is not the strengths, not the capacity, not the courage, not the perseverance, not all of that. The main focus, unfortunately, is trauma and trauma-informed care. And I've been talking lately about resiliency-informed trauma-informed care, which is really a mouthful. But as we work with people, yes, we need to understand the trauma piece, but surround it with this message of resiliency, this attitude of resiliency. So we're coming to the end here. It has been 3 hours. Just one more thing. First of all, thank you all for giving me your afternoon. I always love working with Essex County. And as a conclusion, I want us to do one more quick sharing, not in groups, but as a larger group here. What's one thing that you're going to start doing or keep doing as a result of being here today and getting this resiliency boost? Just one thing, could be for yourself, could be for your work. One thing you're going to start doing or keep doing. And I'm just going to call on people actually to facilitate this. So I'm going to start with you, Roberta. One thing you're going to start doing or keep doing.
Looking at the bright side of everything.
All right, good.
Yeah, I got to read this book too, because the workbook, I remember going through it. I'm going to go in this workbook because it's going to be beneficial personally and toward a training that I'll be looking toward.
Absolutely. And you could be a workbook group facilitator, which would be so wonderful. So, all right, Emma, one thing you're going to start doing or keep doing.
Learn how to use Zoom. I'm going to do the workbook because after the meeting in June with the Community Service Board, I left with a copy of the workbook and I'm like, I'm going to go do this. And then I never did it. And now I'm like, yeah, I really should go back and do that for certain.
Good. Okay. Harry.
It's a 3.5 hour MP3 file that you can download from our training page as well. You could just download it to your phone and listen to it. I find, and it's Nan talking, so it's very comforting.
Oh yeah, it's audio version. So that's the other way. Just listen to it while you're doing your chores, while you're driving in the car.
Yeah. Honestly, it's like podcast worthy. So no, I'm excited to actually utilize that, within the jail. I share the room with substance abuse, alcohol, KSAC, Dennis Hiroshima at St. Joe's, and it's got a nice, it's a disheveled kind of classroom, but I'm going to utilize it more as a classroom in many ways and use it as that, but more of an open dialogue classroom where like you did, Nan, with having the kids involved. It's pretty much those that want to be there, they're going to be there. If they're not, they don't want to, it's kind of, it's there for them, to grow and come out of, I think Dana and I wanted to kind of keep it rigid in some ways because we don't know when people are going to be getting out and whatnot and with time frames, but we can pretty much hammer out 2 chapters per day per session and work through it, you know, with the learning from the last one, and then coming into this next one here in December possibly, and going forward with it. So we're excited. There's a lot of good stuff, and there's a lot of people.
It's exciting. You guys are pioneers. I quote you in my newsletter. It goes around the world.
Awesome. Hey, we're blessed to have you. Blessed to have what you've created.
What are you going to keep doing?
I'm going to continue to create or spread the same language about resiliency across Essex County, from preschool all the way up to senior citizens. So in every crack and cranny of Essex County, we're going to create the same language of resiliency.
Stephanie, what are you going to keep doing? I know you're already doing.
I can't wait to follow up with Deborah and Roberta about supporting them in their efforts to bring a training to their organization. I'm happy to co-facilitate with anyone. I'm happy to be there with you, whatever you need. I gave Harry like what was it, 2 things? Look at him, he just went.
I'm gonna probably need some more. So you know how we filled up all those books? I'm getting it.
I love. You can have more. He comes to our office and
I'll be by.
I'll
be by. I'm coming to the jail tomorrow. I might stop by in the morning. You gonna be there?
We just got a new shipment. Anybody needs books too? We have tons.
I took them out of the box too. They're on the shelf ready for you, Harry.
All right.
Just took them out today.
Sweet. So it's got the new card, the new smell. I like this. All right.
I don't know if
new resiliency smell.
I don't know if Deborah's still with us or not. Oh, she is. Deborah, something you're gonna keep doing, start doing as a result of being here today? I don't know if she's here. Well, let me say it was wonderful to have a representative from Mountain Lake Services here. And I did have a meeting with her and her colleague, Amy, and I'm trying to remember, what's Amy's last names, Stephanie?
Gador. So she's the director of human resources now. And
they were talking about
training for all of this.
Integrating more training into Mountain Lake Services. So this is something that the clients, the staff, I didn't realize what a huge presence it is in your county. It's a big organization. So it's wonderful to have them here today as well. So let me just close by saying, I always get so inspired by working with folks from Essex County. And I just hope you've gotten a little bit of a resiliency boost that you can keep on keeping on doing what you're already doing. And kudos to you. It's just my delight to work with you. So thank you again for spending your afternoon with me. Stephanie will be sending out some more stuff.
Thank you, everybody. And I
thank you,
appreciate
ladies.
You, Nan.
Yes. Thank you, ladies.
First and third Fridays at noon, we're going to do an hour of resiliency coaching. So that'll start in December. All right. Hopefully I'll see some of you then. Take good care.
Bye.